We are about to start the last keynote presentation, so same suggestion, if you can come closer to the speaker, that would be wonderful, because this space is so big that it's a bit intimidating.
Just a clicker. Click in the keyboard. Yeah. Estamos.
¿Estamos?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
¿Ya pusiste la pongo? ¿Ya la pusiste?
Yeah, I need power, just because.
We are in streaming now. I would like to say hello to the people online and to the audience here in the last day of Festival de la Imagen Media Art Histories Conference. I just want to start highlighting the role of many people here in the audience now. For instance, the people who help us moderating the panels the last 3 days. I know it's been an intense and demanding work, so receive our deepest sense of gratitude.
In Becoming, Robert Rauschenberg called reactive environments, and Juan Downey called, of course, the Chilean video artist and interactive artist, called invisible energies, which is a very interesting term. These terms describe artistic installations and perceptual experiences that, enabled through technical interfaces like simple sensors and very crude electronics. In the 1950s, obviously, there were no computers floating around that artists could access, which would enable visitors to go into these spaces and essentially complete these artistic works. So, for instance, in a work like Gruppo T's Spazio Linee Luce Spettatori, what happened was essentially you function like a light switch. You walked around in a dark space. The visitor's motion would block the path of light between a sensor and a receiver, and thereby it would change the sensor's electrical voltage, and that change would be interpreted through hardware and result in triggering of media spectacle, essentially turning lights on and off, spinning motors that would rotate mirrors or prisms or colored gels to shift the color of the space, or starting sound that would rotate mirrors. And so the visitor would get a sense that the artwork was responding to their presence. Now, the same could be said for Juan Downey's 1968 work Against Shadows, where a work made from wood, light bulbs, circuit boards, and photocells basically reacts to the shadows that an individual throws over a perforated horizontal surface, recreating the shapes on a wall-mounted grid of activated light bulbs. You can see it there. Thus, we might say that there is an emergence of a new understanding of the role of the visitor and the distribution of their agency, as Downey said, a kind of invisible energy among the components of a complex system. Indeed, it's interesting to see one of the reasons why Downey was so interested in these interactive systems from this quote. I quote, "Interactive works create the illusion that the public can participate in the work of art. Actually, we are still spectators, mystified by the order that makes the world grow and move, although we pretend we are determining what happens to us," unquote. Such a genre of works is well understood and described in media art history, also art history. But I want to take another lens here on immersion, one that understands immersive environments as themselves a specific kind of what I'm calling now a sensory technical infrastructure whose aim it is to capture human action and to reorganize it in relationship to computation. And here I use the American computer scientist and social scientist Philip Agri's notion of capture, which describes a process in which, quote, human activity is reconstructed by machine systems through assimilation to a transcendent, he calls this virtual, order of mathematical formalism, unquote. You can just take a look at this quote. It's actually quite profound what he says. He says, our action is essentially represented by machines through a form of mathematical formalism that we have no access to. Now, such projects that I'd also describe could be, as Andreas brought up, as a kind of sensing machine, and that's a term that shows up in this book from the MIT Press in 22. And a sensing machine is simply a kind of, let's say, a work that's a heterogeneous assemblage of human and machine components that sense, act on, and co-produce new kinds of subjects and new kinds of effects. Now, this constellation can be described by this very useful term from science and technology studies, co-production, in which the human senses are shaped through the interaction with the senses of machines and vice versa. Now, this, as I said, concept comes from Sheila Jasanoff at Harvard and SDS. It's important here. Now, there's a lot of different ways you could interpret co-production. But in the context of artistic work, you can say that essentially it's not only that the artwork is produced through the viewer and the participant, as most of us understand, but actually the human subject of the artwork is also co-produced through their interaction with the work. So in other words, there's a bi-directional relationship. And so the central question in this talk is, what kind of human subject emerges in the process of interacting within such a complex technical system? And I'm going to come back to this question at the end of the talk because it brings up some incredibly important political questions around the role we have as subjects and how much we can actually know about the world. Now, to give you a sense of how such sensory technical infrastructures function, and more importantly, the kind of political, social imaginaries they enable, I'm just going to focus on actually mainly two examples today. One is historical, and the knowledge that I'm going to give you is gained from archival research, and the second is contemporary, and that knowledge is gained from ethnography. Now, these two examples will serve as the kind of basis for my argument around what might be happening around the politics, aesthetics, and practices of these so-called works in becoming today. So let's go to 1965. In 1965, the pioneering feminist theater director, Joan Littlewood, teamed up with an experimental avant-garde architect named Cedric Price, here with his cigar, and eccentric psychologist and engineer Gordon Pask, to create a new kind of sensing machines, a, quote, university of the streets they labeled the Fun Palace. Seeking to build what the creative team called a, quote, laboratory of pleasure, unquote, the Fun Palace was to be a colossal, flexible architectural structure, a many-leveled environment consisting of moving walkways, escalators, and ephemeral architectural materials like vapor and light curtains, which would be capable of continually rearranging itself in response to the events that would take place within. How a flexible yet built environment imagined to accommodate 50,000 visitors at a time would be able to change its architectural form on a moment's notice remained a mystery, one that Pask was determined, along with Littlewood and Price, to solve. Pask, who had gone from designing a futuristic musical instrument called the Musicolor that produced colors in relationship to electronic tones, and then conceiving of teaching machines and chemical computers, was an ideal collaborator. He would allow Littlewood and Price the possibility of recovering and reconceiving their playful vision to be emblematic of feedback through the emerging scientific paradigm of cybernetics. And now here's a kind of an image of this thing that was supposed to be built in London where the Roundhouse is now situated. Now, the political belief that sensing machines could create a new kind of self through adaptive cycles of feedback did not come out of nowhere. Feedback, of course, is the central concept of cybernetics, which Pask was a key player in the UK. The founder of cybernetics, the American mathematician Norbert Wiener, defined it as, of course, the entire field of control and communication theory, whether in the machine or the animal. But as Jose Carlos pointed out 2 days ago, the kind of MIT vision of Wiener, or even the British vision of cybernetics, is not enough to understand the global impact of the discipline. And clearly, of course, in Latin America, it has a very powerful historical legacy from the work of people like the Chilean biologists Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela, and of course also someone like Downey as an artist. Now, cybernetics aim to study the ability of machines, whether biological or mechanical, to steer their own behavior through feedback loops that would occur through sensing and affecting, i.e. changing their external environments. Information and messages sent between the components of a system would establish structures of organization and enable the system to organize and self-regulate its behavior within, without influence or control from the outside. While principally a scientific domain entangled with corporate and military inventions of the period that led to technological breakthroughs in areas such as signal processing, machine automation, and robotics, cybernetics was also, of course, quickly adapted into non-scientific contexts as well, from running economies and designing the flow of cities to making art. Because early cybernetics was modeled on the neurophysiology of sensing and affecting systems that could adapt their actions through feedback, its framework of feedback and response supplied scientists like Pask with the conceptual and technical tools they needed. But cybernetics also provided a curious political context, one delicately balanced between freedom and regulation that, in contrast to the aesthetic liberation its philosophy suggested, would pose large and unanswered questions around the issues of governance that the Fun Palace sought to experiment with in real life. Now, Pask closely collaborated with Littlewood and Price to develop the Fun Palace as a gigantic machine at architectural scale based on core cybernetic principles: sensing, feedback, control, self-regulation, and learning. He brought to the project prodigious knowledge of feedback modeling systems, game theory, control theory, and operations research, all of which was used in the 1950s to essentially, as he said, use games and tests that psychologists and electronics engineers now devise for the service of industry or war. Even more importantly, Pask saw the project as something beyond fun. It would be a profound environment for, quote, transcending the familiar. With Pask's collaboration, then, the Fun Palace was rethought from an responsive architectural environment to an algorithmic modeling system. Sensors were imagined to capture visitor flow patterns, group movement, and even, quote, what is likely to induce happiness, unquote. Obscure mathematical disciplines at the time, such as decision theory and predictive modeling, would model this data. And these are, of course, techniques being used in machine learning today. The feedback cycle was foolproof. If the input was unmodified people, it goes to the network, the output was modified people. Now, what is so curious is Littlewood, who was a radical Marxist theater maker of anti-war agitational propaganda plays, the most famous being Oh, What a Lovely War, which toured around to union halls in Britain in the 1950s and 1960s. Was she aware of the possibilities of new forms of political and social control that might emerge from the Fun Palace's cybernetic foundations? Clearly. Writing in a 1968 manifesto called A Laboratory of Fun, the non-program, she was, of course, the head of the project committee, she not ironically claimed that, quote, the Fun Palace would be a foretaste of the pleasures of 1984, unquote, referring to George Orwell's dystopian future vision of total surveillance. In other words, the pleasure and control enabled by technologies would just go hand in hand. They would be necessary bedfellows for the new and radical forms of experience that the Fun Palace, as a sensing machine for both aesthetic pleasure and social transformation, sought to provide the public. Now, as you can imagine, the Fun Palace was never realized. Although financing had been secured and a site in central London identified, they even had a whole committee of fundraisers like Yehudi Menuhin and others, the governor, the mayor of London. The inevitable complexity of a project stretching over multiple years made it untenable. Architects Richard Rogers and Renzo Piano claimed that their controversial 1975 Centre Pompidou, of course it opened in 77, but was directly inspired by Littlewood, Price, and Pask's vision. This is a rather weak comparison. The Pompidou is a standard museum, whereas the Fun Palace was conceived to be something much more, a new kind of social organism that would adapt and change based on its inhabitants, bringing them joy and pleasure while monitoring and quantifying them at the same time. In other words, the Fun Palace reinforces the extraordinary and yet historically grounded idea that immersion and hence participation could not exist without their counterparts of control and regulation. Contrary to the belief that artists could humanize systems designed for measurement and governance by placing them into artistic contexts, it would be these very processes of sensing, feedback, decision modeling, and prediction that profoundly transformed immersive artistic experiences into a subtle and yet powerful form of social engineering. 2019, Japan. If you take the Yurakamome elevated subway line near Tokyo Bay, you soon enter Odaiba, a chunk of reclaimed land filled with futuristic hotels, amusement centers, and office buildings. So now what I'm going to give you is some direct ethnography from a visit to Team Lab Borderless. Amid a Toyota showroom in a shopping area called Pallet Town, there is a metal-clad building, the Mori Building Digital Art Museum. From its drab outside, one would never expect this museum without a map would hold something verging on the spectacular. The Tokyo-based art collective Team Lab's permanent multi-room media spectacle called Epson Team Lab Borderless. It's called Epson for a specific reason I'll get to in a second. This 10,000 square meter artwork leaves me almost speechless when I visited in early March 2019. Now, that's ancient history. Since then, Team Lab operates around the globe, from restaurants and casinos in Macau to a new experience building in Abu Dhabi. Team Lab is the Disney of the 21st century, albeit without Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck. After paying a $35 entrance fee, I enter into an enormous labyrinth of rooms. Every surface, wall, floor, and ceiling is bathed in computer-generated projections of animated butterflies, waterfalls, blooming flowers, and swarming birds. A space with mirrored floors called Crystal World is filled with clear strands of some 300,000 LED lights that pulse, burst, and shimmer, producing mesmerizing waves of light. New age electronic synthesizer music accompanies the ever-transforming digital forms laid on to the real architecture. Borderless is indeed a sensing machine, a combination of hardware, software, computers, and bodies, tout court, that is exemplary of a new kind of sensory technical infrastructure. Indeed, if infrastructure in science and technology studies parlance, according to Starr and Roulater, quote, is never a thing, but a relation, unquote, among many parts of a complex interactive system, then Team Lab fits the bill. Now, why? Because it folds us as visitors into its operations, expanding our senses and leaving us awed and numbed in the same breath. It seeks to give the impression that we have agency, an active hand in creating a unique visual experience for us and others around us. We move and the computer-generated butterflies swim around us. We step into a zone and are greeted by unfolding Chinese characters and digital watercolors. The capture of our presence is necessary for the machines to work, and our participation tightly couples to them. The customer visitor is the new creator in an event specifically designed and engineered to leave us borderless. Now, how is such a wondrous media hallucination in the midst of Tokyo achieved? The magic ingredients are impressive. 520 network computers, 470 Epson video projectors, and hundreds, I counted it, 1,262 sensors. Dozens of cameras capture the spectator's movement and use it to partially trigger audiovisual events. Similar to standard home security systems, the cameras, together with infrared LEDs that only cameras see, serve as motion sensors, detecting and tracking how much heat visitors give off. The cameras are like those that long have greeted us in Asian airports and after COVID-19 in airports around the world, which measure the temperature of newly arriving visitors to check whether they are feverish. The triggered animations and effects pull the visitors deep into the spectacle, transforming them from passive onlookers into active participants. If I come near the walls or step in a particular area of the floor, the cameras detect this and the payoff comes: the ability to influence the quality, density, or action of the animated projections that fly over the surfaces of the spaces. To enable borderless visitors to influence the media landscape, the cameras and their software use sophisticated techniques derived from computer vision. All processes birthed in the 1980s in research labs, which of course now have become standard in even home doorbells. But there's one fundamental thing the sensors don't know: the significance of a human body and what it can do. The images borderless cameras capture are not meant for human perception, but for algorithms. What is sensed ignores most of the features we associate with being human. The algorithms can't measure the degree of joy or confusion we experience as we lose ourselves in borderless's maze of sensory impressions. They don't know what histories we carry into the room, what physical disabilities we have, what emotions we may harbor inside. Not yet. For all intents and purposes, to these camera sensors, we are simply groupings of bright or darker pixels, calculated based on ever-changing frames in a ceaseless flow of images that rush into these devices. Indeed, for all its claims toward provoking the human experience of awe and wonder, it would also not be too much of a stress to describe Borderless as a work bordering on what the French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard called the a-human. In a 1984 article for Le Monde, the French philosopher Lyotard, who explored the postmodern condition of knowledge societies with government funding from the province of Quebec in the 1980s, claimed that scientific areas like AI, computer vision, or robotics, to name a few, were already preparing us for a new era beyond the human. It's worth quoting a specific passage in its entirety here. Here, there's a shorter quote. Lyotard says, quote, "I simply maintain that there is nothing human about scientific expression and expansion. Perhaps our brain is the temporary bearer of a process of complexification. It would then be a matter of detaching this process from what it has supported up to now. I am convinced that you people, i.e. scientists, this is what you're in the process of doing. Computer science, genetic engineering, physics and astrophysics, astronautics, robotics, and now, of course, we can add AI. And this is actually something that AI was something Lyotard was looking at as he was co-curating the famous Pompidou exhibition Les Matériaux in the 1980s. These disciplines are already working toward preserving that complexity under conditions of life independent of life on Earth. But I do not see in what respect this is human. If by human we mean collectivities with their cultural traditions, established in a given period in precise locations on this planet. I don't doubt for a second this a-human process may have some fringe benefits that are useful for humanity alongside its destructive effects. But this has nothing to do with the emancipation of human beings, unquote. In other words, Borderless's sensory technical infrastructure demonstrates that an interplay between immersion and participation, enabled through ahuman technologies, creates a new cultural normal, one where scale is important, just as important as content or meaning. For example, along with TeamLab, similar immersive formulas have cropped up in the last 6 or 7 years by international creative organizations with names like Meow Wolf, Dreamscape, Immersive, Moment Factory, Immersive Van Gogh, Immersive Picasso, Immersive Mucha, Grand Palais Immersive, Dark Matter, Super Blue, Punch Drunk, and most importantly, the Sphere in Las Vegas. The Sphere itself is endemic of our new conception of immersive economies. Although sensors and seats that had originally been planned and individual audio-visual smell experience were scrapped, it nonetheless gathers data the moment you purchase a high-price entrance ticket. The Sphere is the brainchild of a New York billionaire, the son of the founder of HBO, who owns Madison Square Garden, one of the largest sports and entertainment areas in the United States, and who is also known to use artificial intelligence-based face recognition technologies to identify and eject people whose law firms are tied up in litigation with the billionaire's business interests. But as a modern technological marvel, the Sphere is unparalleled in its technical scale. You can see here. It's taller than the Statue of Liberty and a little smaller than the Great Pyramid of Giza. The Sphere is 110 meters in height, 16K by 16K interior LED screen measuring some 160,000 square feet, a 53,000 square meter exterior LED screen covered in 1 million LEDs that functions as the world's largest and brightest billboard, an inside sound system featuring 1,586 loudspeaker modules, 167,000 speaker drivers, amplifiers, and processing channels, and 300 mobile loudspeaker modules. It is impressive, but conceptually, is it new? What was media immersion before the age of the wraparound screen, sensing, and AI? These historical images, visionary and realized, give you a clue. Already, of course, in the 1950s and especially 1960s, world expositions in far-flung places like Brussels, New York, Montreal, and Osaka were seen as the premier international sites to get a glimpse of the technological future. As art historian Carolyn Jones describes in her work, The Global Work of Art, such infrastructures of spectacle aim to detach, quote, the citizen from her locale and inscribe her in a stirring narrative of man's universal progress, unquote. World fairs were sites, of course, Osaka just opened. World fairs were sites in which the subjective experience of art and humans were thrown into relief against the objective displays of technoscientific wonder and industrial sublimes. Yet today's industrial sublime is other. Immersion is less an object and more of a branded infrastructure in the data economies of cognitive capitalism. It has shifted its playing field away from nation building, as we can see from the United States, and instead toward a new politics of experience dependent on corporatized visions of such expressions. For instance, Yayoi Kusama's artworks focused on the obliteration of the self give way to therapeutic polka dots adorning Louis Vuitton wallets cases, which is fantastic for her. Eliasson's phenomena-based The Weather Project turns to objects in Vuitton's window displays. Rafik Anadol's data paintings become a backdrop for Dior fashion shows. In a 2022 New Yorker article, author Anna Wiener, The Rise of Immersive Art, in which artworks constructed for museums architects are now, quote, seen as financial assets, unquote. Indeed, conscious or not, many new immersive organizations have adopted a well-known playbook for their strategies. In a seminal article, this becomes later a book, that appeared in the July 1998 issue of Harvard Business Review, entitled Welcome to the Experience Economy, business consultants Joe Pine and James Gilmore describe how experience, quote, the staging of memorable events by a company, unquote, should be pursued as a novel and distinct form of economic output. Yet all is not well. Many, while immensely popular, many immersive experiences are problematic to art historians and critics who see the aim at self-obliteration through the machinery of digital technology as problematic. This can be seen in the response of the art critic Hal Foster, who claimed that in works of artists like James Turrell, the late American video artist Bill Viola, or Oliver Eliasson, that, quote, their immersive installations in which body, image, and space often seem to exist in one continuum tend to purify the artifice rather than to redirect it. In other words, what these artists do is produce an immense space of rarefied pictoriality that is technologically manufactured in order to appear perceptually pure, unquote. But is there something else beneath the glossy economic surface of such immersive, technologically augmented experiences which feature cheap hand-waving interaction and rooms filled with gigapixel projections of Van Gogh? The answer lies perhaps in one direction, in an argument that the French cultural critic Jacques Rancière argued in The Politics of Aesthetics, where he argued that aesthetic experience, what he called the distribution of the sensible, is bound up with political framing and context. According to Rancière, politics revolves around what is seen and what can be said about it, around who has the ability to see and the talent to speak, around the properties of spaces and the possibilities of time. In other words, politics through statements and positions, or environments and actions, produces regimes of sensible intensity, new kinds of relations between the modes of being and saying, the modes of doing and making. Linked to such regimes of sensible intensity is what Rancière, in his book The Emancipative Spectator, calls the constant battle between distance and immersion, what he termed the tension between, quote, distant inquiry and vital embodiment. Two white European figures, Bertolt Brecht on the left and Antonin Artaud on the right, in which, quote, with Brecht, the spectator has to become more distant in order to make political decisions, and with Artaud, the spectator must lose any distance to be transformed in a profound manner. Perhaps such seemingly incommensurable paradigm between distance and immersion are also representative of TeamLab on the one side and the Fun Palace on the other. But what are we going to make then, going back to our two examples, Fun Palace and TeamLab, what are we supposed to make, for instance, of TeamLab's Borderless in the age of AI and sensing? Of course, Borderless, unlike the Fun Palace, actually exists. It is a materialized thing you can enter and experience directly with your body at a scale and popularity that the Fun Palace team could never have dreamed of. As I said, scale is paramount to immersion, as you saw earlier. But at the same time, TeamLab also basically kind of reworks the histories of immersive spectacle. The phantasmagoria, of course, as people know, from the 18th century in Europe, were essentially these environments of spectacle, optical illusions of ghosts and phantasms projected onto the walls of darkened rooms by means of new technologies of the time, which Oliver, of course, has written a lot about, the magic lantern. Pepper's Ghost, for instance, technique from 1860s, is used by TeamLab to create a room of moving creatures on glass walls. Floor-to-ceiling projections recall early IMAX films and spectacles of world fairs of the past, and also, of course, the Infinity Rooms of Kusama become also the fodder and content for TeamLab. So Borderless uses this differentiated history, cultural history, and human visitors to produce something of cultural sameness. The Fun Palettes, however, was after something else, a profound moment of human transformation called transcending the familiar, achieved through a vision in which politics and aesthetics could meet in a liberatory way. Today, as Borderless reveals, control and feedback no longer seem to even matter. They are so deeply enmeshed in contemporary artistic experiences that we no longer even think about their once radical significance to transform not only spaces, but also the people that move through them. To, as Andrew Pickering writes, quote, experiment with new and unforeseen ways to be. Immersion by whatever means necessary, but not necessarily as progressive social and collective transformation. In Borderless, you are an individual, and your interaction with the environment by way of sensors is almost a distraction rather than a feature. Of course, you're with many, many people, but you don't really pay much attention to them. The installation's success comes about due to its status as an artistic thrill ride, the equivalent of a sensory roller coaster. The ability of visitors to influence the space because of their behavior is almost something of an afterthought for TeamLab. Borderless's imaginary is ultimately an individual reality, one wholly different than the Fun Palace's collective one. But how could one think otherwise? TeamLab. When we live in a sensory technical context in which more electronic sensors and computers than people now occupy the planet, some 50 billion in 2020, and now expected by 2030 to be 1 trillion. This is a context where doorbells, thermostats, appliances, and loudspeakers double as surveillance devices, where workers' brainwaves are monitored in offices and factory floors to detect stress and increase efficiency, while the newest gaming HMDs feature hundreds of sensors to capture motion, voice, action, and maybe even sex. Where new technologies in behavioral biometrics designed to reduce cybersecurity threats are able to measure hundreds of parameters based on the common sensors in our smartphones, the angle at which we hold the device, the patterns of presses on the surfaces, the speed of rotation every time you turn your phone from portrait to landscape, that's calculated, and how fast you open an application. And when I was doing work on sensing machines, I was reading patents which were truly terrifying. In fact, from a single cell phone, they can capture around 12 to 1,300 parameters that they use to monitor and protect the sites you're on. Where these technologies essentially that are objective perpetuate long-grained human biases. For instance, soap dispensers using IR sensing detect motion under faucets favor lighter skin than darker skin. Facial recognition software identifies usually only white faces. Alexa and Google Home microphones discriminate against Indian and Black English. Where wearable mood trackers measure feelings, where brain-computer interfaces and advanced language models are being researched by that ever-trustworthy firm Meta. You see, Meta's new research becomes decoding thoughts from the brain. To airline seats, which basically are wired with heart rate monitors that sense and display a passenger's mood. A useful feature to head off potential altercations with flight attendants if you become an unruly customer. But this is the newest. This is 2019, but it's increased now for the US immigration. They can capture the image of your face and send it directly to US border control. Now, Marshall McLuhan argued that artists function as a distant early warning system for technological transformations to come. That the arts would be a warning signal comes as no surprise. Immersive experiences in the 20th and the 21st centuries, from the visual arts and gaming, immersive theater, or TeamLab, have more than proven and gone beyond McLuhan's argument that media are indeed extensions of our senses. In fact, now, our senses are indeed extensions of media. These new immersive and participatory experiences have been conceived as environments of shock and wonder that turn the human senses inside out by way of machine automation and sensing infrastructure. As a sensing machine, for instance, TeamLab's borderless demonstrates that the line between the human senses that is increasingly going to be blurrier and blurrier, human and machine sensing, to prepare for the period, as Lyotard said, of conditions of life independent of life on Earth. I'm going to conclude in the last 3 minutes by returning to the question of what kind of subject emerges within these new immersive spaces, these new sensing environments that are so de rigueur at the moment. What does it mean that the user is part of the operations of a work? Not only just triggering it to respond, but becoming part of it, an inseparable part of it. To perhaps suggest one direction, I'm going to end my talk with an unusual figure, someone I've been studying for years, actually. The 20th century economist and political theorist Friedrich Hayek. Although Hayek is known as one of the founders of neoliberalism, the idea that swallowed the world, Hayek also did some work as a master's student in the University of Zurich neuroscience department in the early 1920s. And he, in 1952, wrote a rather obscure book of psychology that most psychologists dismissed at the time, in which he sets out early ideas of the concept, believe it or not, of neural networks, along with others. Hayek's concept of this, what he called the sensory order, is appropriate to our post-pandemic world, especially in light of an increasing awareness of the deep entanglement among humans, machines, and their environments. As Hayek argued, the sensory order is simply a product of our nervous system. The smell of freshly baked bread, or empanadas here, the sound of the pounding ocean, the blinding dazzle of sunlight against a snow-dusted landscape is simply the result of a complex symphony of billions of interconnected neurons continually organizing and reorganizing and firing electrical and chemical signals between each other. To uncover the relation between stimuli, sensation, and perception, the three key elements in psychology of sensing and perceiving, Hayek needed to show, quote, why and how the senses classify similar physical stimuli, sometimes as alike and sometimes as different, unquote. These structures of difference are what Hayek called orders, an arrangement of parts of a greater whole put in relationship to one another according to a preconceived plan. But Hayek's sensory order is different. It is not planned or humanly designed, but emerges in a spontaneous and self-organizing way because, quote, such an order is not made by anybody, but forms itself, unquote. In other words, perception, including now the perception of machines, is an ordering system. This is, I think, a quite profound idea that we perceive, and we can say we and the machines perceive, to order the world. Hayek's reimagination of sensing and perception is a vastly similar way to widespread explosion of machine-based deep learning at the end of the 2000s has an air of uncanniness to it. Even though the sensory order is ostensibly about the human mind, more than human minds haunt its pages. In fact, in more than a few examples, Hayek describes a machine with the task to classify and order balls of various sizes and distribute them. This thought machine sorts out objects. It is, for all intents and purposes, a toy designed to communicate how the mind classifies an undifferentiated mass of stimuli coming at it. But Hayek also describes another machine. This one, quote, sorts individual signals arriving through any one of a large number of wires and tubes, unquote. This sorting and classifying machine has a striking similarity to another kind of mind that might not qualify as human. Of course, it is like a computer in which, quote, certain statistical machines for sorting cards on which the punch holes represent statistical data, unquote, Hayek wrote. And, quote, if we regard the appearance of any card with the same data punched on it as the recurrence of the same event, and assume that the machine is so arranged that various groups of different data are placed into the same receptacle, we should then have a machine which performs a calculation and classification in the sense that the human mind does, in the sense in which we use this term, unquote. Thus, by specifying a machine that classifies the noisy stimulus of the world into new sensory orders, Hayek has the upper hand as he anticipates in the 1950s what is to come. In other words, through his interest in neural networks and cybernetics, the principles of self-organization and self-regulation in the brain, but also in the market, Hayek helps us redefine sensing for our computational machine age. It is not simply the mind looking for physical correspondences out there in the world. Rather, the sensory order in the machine-based sensing and learning depends on former experience. Its operations are on data which is already existing and are spontaneous, emergent, complex, and importantly, beyond human knowing. This is a famous essay he wrote, The Use of Knowledge in Society, where he said that the sensory order in machine sensing and learning depends on this former experience. Even the scientists or artists building these new human-machine configurations don't know what's really going on, fulfilling Hayek's belief that as human subjects, we have definite limits of knowledge concerning any complex, spontaneous, arising order or system. In other words, knowledge is not given to anyone in its totality. In other words, what our new sensible, immersive environments replete with co-produced sensing and perceiving demonstrate is that our sensing, classifying, and learning machines are so integrated in how we now live and breathe that there is less and less separation between us and them anymore. But as I've shown you, and as artists have shown us, this separation is fragile in the first place. Our senses and selves have long ceased to be other from the technical world, if they ever were. The sensing machines are not simply out there, they are us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'm positive we will have questions or comments, so we have time for 3 at least.
I know that was a lot.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for that talk. It was awesome. I was thinking 2 things mainly. The first one is that I remember in the work of Walter Benjamin, in the work of art, etc., there was this quote when he said that I think he was thinking some things similar to what you presented here. And he put that example where there was this surveillance camera and an actor. So he said, okay, the surveillance camera is this device to record and survey what people do. But the actor, I would say here that the artist maybe just lies to it. So, because it's film, it's art, right?
Yeah,
it's not like this percent of reality. I was thinking that maybe in this time, the artists should think, am I going to be the surveillance cam? Am I going to make it like work better or am I going to be the actor so I can lie to it? And the second thing was that a conferencist earlier talked about the work of Juk Ui, where he presents this idea that technology is, I know the sphere, the screens, everything. I know that you presented this with cybernetics that beyond this digitalization of the world. So it would also be interesting to hear what do you think of these other technologies that are not precisely like this main idea that we tend to think that screens, computers, machines, but awesome, thanks.
Yeah, and thanks for the question. I mean, I think the most important thing that Benjamin says in that essay is that, first of all, technology is historically grounded, doesn't just come from the air. And second of all, that there is no outside anymore. Of course, he's talking about cinema and comparing theater and cinema and their relationships to each other. The other important thing is that, I mean, we can debate this, but I think Benjamin is ambiguous. And that's what I'm hoping also in this talk, is that this is an ambiguous relationship we have. It's not simply just surveillance capitalism where, as Zuboff or many people in critical AI say, these technologies are thrust from Silicon Valley and, take our data. We want that too. Why are so many people on Instagram? Why are so many people constantly sending data to these systems? So there is a mutual co-production going on, and that's why I said that's a very important lesson from science and technology studies everyone should learn, that it's not only one way, it's both ways. And of course, artists are, in the same relationship. I mean, the things I'm making, the things my colleagues are making, yes, it's part of this modern, oddly enough, condition, because it's this tension between, as I was trying to point out, between control. I mean, art is a lot of times about control, and that's why the Downey quote is so important, because he's like, you tend to think, participation, this is an amazing social liberation, but this is total nonsense, because artists and institutions set those terms, and that's fine. I mean, but just admit it. So of course, and there's attempts to constantly escape that. But now we're in an era where the technologies are no longer in laboratories that are hidden from us. They can come out immediately, and we have access to them, and things are just thrown out in the market without knowing what the consequences are. So that's what I think artists are trying to figure out, as well as scholars, as well as scientists too.
Okay, another question or comment?
Yeah, I have a question over here. Thank you, Chris, for such an, I think, inspiring but also frightening talk. You mentioned surveillance capitalism. I heard of Guy Debord and the Spectacle Society and so many ideas about this. And at the end you said, we are the machine, something like that, like we are the sensing machine. We have become that. And my question is, so we cannot resist that from the art medium, like we have become that also and I connect this talk with Jose Ramon's before, when he said modern art needs to be connected, needs to be interactive, and we have to make that a spectacle. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I like this quote from Felix Guattari, where he says that the purpose of art is to essentially deterritorialize or detach a part of the real and reinvent it. So, of course, why do authoritarian or fascist governments like Trump, for instance, or Orban or Putin now, go after artists first? Well, because they try to create imaginaries of what might be, not what is. So that's the resistance, is just producing things and trying to put them out there and trying to create another way of imagining. Because the visions of just we talk about, of Meta or OpenAI are a fairly limited one at that, even though they claim, this is going to transform collective society. So, I mean, I think what I'm trying to point out, this is a very complicated question, and technology is neither liberatory nor is it completely predatory. It is situated in the world specifically. People design it. My friend Jonathan Stern, who passed away in March, he said, we always have this idea of technology with the impact narrative, that it falls from the sky and changes how we are. GPT changes this, the iPhone changes. This is not true. Technology is as human as it is ahuman, as Lyotard said. So we have to grapple with that. And I think, in education, in the arts, the key idea is that people understand this concept, that the technology is both us and it is not us. Yeah.
So, last question.
Yes, it was really a very inspiring talk. Thank you, Chris. I just to ask one question, but also to share some thoughts they were developing when I was listening to you. Quite recently, 2-3 years ago, I was researching and preparing the exhibition Cybernetics, mostly focused on the work of Wen-Ying Tsai, one of the pioneers of cybernetic art. And he made installations that propose the audience to perceive phenomena that doesn't exist really. Mm-hmm. I just name it similarly to you in certain phantasmagoric. And so I asked myself then, we know that machine sense the world differently than humans perceive it. But does it the same world? Maybe we have to do with the situation that machine sense different world than humans do. Mm-hmm. And because we merge these forms of sensing all the time now, so what's getting out of the merge of what machine sense and human perceive? You refer to the concept of knowledge and Hayek, finally. I thought about Wittgenstein, saying that the limits of our world are defined by the limits of our language.
And language, yeah.
Yeah, doesn't mean that to understand what we see and what we are immersed in, we have to describe it, to define it, and name it. That's the question.
That's a fantastic question. And maybe I'll just conclude by my rant against large language models. They should be called large text models. Because as Wittgenstein says, language, is a description that constructs a world, right? Do we have to, deal with the world through language? Well, obviously, this is how we imagine intelligence to be, right? Of course, language is one side and image is the other. But what about all that stuff that's not language? That is in human movement and nonverbal ways of understanding the world. That's ignored in many ways. Now, does that construct the world? I mean, clearly, scientists building robots know this. I mean, I was in Japan in December, and Rolf Pfeiffer, one of the founders of embodied artificial intelligence, ran the AI lab at the University of Zurich for many years. He said, point blank, intelligence without a body is not intelligent. That's what Lyotard asks as well. And he says, can we have thought without a body? Obviously, people think we can, but we'll see what is left out as we're moving forward very fast. Thanks.
There was one more question. I'm sorry, Chris.
There's one more question. Oh, Oliver, you get the final word.
Yeah, thank you for your brilliant keynote. It was amazing, the tour d'horizon, and also fantastic analysis of the latest phenomena like Team Lab and Las Vegas and so on. But I wonder about Hayek. He obviously is a quoted by neoliberalists, and it's interesting to use him. But also with this, the quotes, they sound teasing, though, like knowledge not given a totality and human-machine ordering system. But as we know, these theories are more than 100 years old, so how can we use them towards to analyze the latest digital revolution? And then also the system question. I wonder what and you know this, of course, but immersion is also used in dictatorships, actually often in dictatorships.
Yeah.
Mostly, I would say, in North Korea and China, and it was historically also in Iraq and Syria and all these countries. So what do you make out of that?
Yeah, I mean, in fact, you know, in this Hal Foster essay about minimalism, he basically tries to make that connection between, you know, the politics of immersion. Of course, he talks about Riefenstahl, but other spectacles. That, of course, that's the problem. This problem of distance, you know, that we're in the spectacle, and what distance is it? And I think the experience, you know, Team Lab is quite interesting in that sense, because you are so immersed. But you have when you leave, it's like, what was that? You have no ability to sit there going, what is this trying to do to me? In fact, my friend Takashi Gami, quite well-known Japanese artificial life researcher, said Team Lab doesn't work for him. First of all, it's entertainment for him. Second of all, he says it breaks embeddedness, because he can always see the line where the pixels are not actually accurate on the ground, and these kinds of things. So in fact, it already breaks this illusion of total immersion. The Hayek thing is more interesting. I mean, first of all, you know, it is now it starts to appear more and more. But what I find very interesting is that not only did Hayek write that book, but Donald Hebb, when he wrote the Organization of Behavior, which is the first thinking about neuroplasticity and connectionism, how neurons connect, the famous line about neurons that wire together, fire together. Cites Hayek, and then Rosenblatt, who built the perceptron, which is the first, like, let's say, working neural network, a big machine in Cornell Aeronautics Lab in Buffalo in the late 1950s. In his article about that, he cites Hayek. Now, this is very strange. And so then, of course, the link goes to the question of knowledge, and I just read Quinn Slobodian. He's a U.S. Historian at Boston University who's an expert in neoliberalism. And he has a new book called Hayek's Bastards. It's fantastic if you want to read it, to try to understand what the new right is in the United States, but also AfD and others. And they all are still using Hayek, even though they're rewriting Hayek's work, you know. And it's very interesting, because this idea that one cannot know, despite the fact that science is so much about the production of knowledge, you know, you cannot know the complexity of a system. And Hayek is not only, you know, one of the thinkers about neural nets, he's also one of the thinkers about complex systems, which is quite extraordinary. Of course, he's talking about economics, but he says, inside such complex system of which we are now in, and this is where the connection to now, I think, is so important. We do not know the whole of what is happening. We cannot know. All we can know is the signaling being given off by, well, Hayek said, prices in the market. And this is, I think, extremely important thing to think about as we build more and more of these complex systems that have behaviors that are emergent, that are not predetermined, that are not designed, and where are we then as humans in those systems? And I think that's the legacy that's not Hayek's work on serfdom and the social calculation problem and all that. That's not useful anymore, because that was about Russia. and about communism and against central planning. But this idea, epistemologically, that knowledge gets reimagined by a complex way of looking at the world is what we are in now.
Thank you very much, Chris. This was fantastic. Definitely the last part of the keynote answered the question, where are you going next? And we are waiting for that book. So just to remind you that after lunch, we will have a presentation by Alessandro Ludovico at 12:45 here, talking about, sorry?
Which everyone needs to come to.
1:45, presenting the mesmerizing history of the Neural Journal and magazine that is 30 years now. So, friend, enjoy the stage in a couple of hours. And Chris, again, it was fascinating. Let's eat something.